Welcome to the DePaul College of Education Winter Forum on Adverse Childhood Experiences, and I am going to introduce our panel. And panelists, you can raise your hand when I introduce you. Audrey Stilleman, Dr. Audrey Stilleman, is an integrative family physician and clinical assistant professor who serves as the Associate Director of Medical Affairs for the UIC Office of Community Engagement, and also the medical director for its school health center program. Since 1991, she has been providing comprehensive care for the whole family, from babies to senior citizens. Dr. Stilleman, in addition to her medical training, has received additional training in family therapy, mind-body medicine, mindfulness, and trauma-informed care. She's worked in a variety of both public and private practice settings, caring for patients, teaching medical students and residents. She is also the co-founder of THEN. This is a very long name. The Center for the Collaborative Study of Trauma, Health Equity, and Neurobiology. She serves as a steering committee member of the Illinois ACEs Coalition, a response collaborative, and is also chair of its health committee. We're delighted to have Dr. Stilleman here. Next, I'm doing this in the order of their speaking, is Lauren Williams, is a licensed professional counselor who is currently completing her doctorate in education. She has over 12 years of counseling experience in many communities, in community agencies, in private practice, and in Chicago schools, particularly on the south and west side of Chicago. Her areas of specialty include, but aren't limited to, trauma counseling, sexual assault, domestic violence, and child-parent psychotherapy. She also works with Sunshine Enterprises in the Woodlawn community on the south side of Chicago. She serves on the advisory committee, and I'm not going to read the whole name again, for THEN. Lauren is passionate, which you will see tonight, about working to uplift and support community, helping others to not only recognize trauma, but to process and heal. Our third speaker is Christine Argue-Mason, has over 16 years of experience as a high school English teacher in the south suburbs of Chicago. She gained firsthand knowledge of the challenges students face and the impact that supporting these students has on the educators who teach and care about them. Since since 2009, Christine has been on the staff with the Illinois Education Association since 2016 in the position of an instructional resource and professional development director. She has had a primary focus of developing and delivering professional development to meet the Illinois Education Association's objective of building awareness of adverse childhood experiences, and is helping implement trauma-informed practices in Illinois, across Illinois, in schools throughout Illinois. She is delighted, absolutely delighted, to share such vital information that will undoubtedly change the educational landscape for our most vulnerable students. And I'm going to introduce Dr. Ackerman again, because she's going to moderate the panel and offer some opening remarks. So the first thing I want to tell you about Dr. Ackerman is that in 2018, last year, she was named the Counselor Educator of the Year for the state of Illinois. It's a pretty big deal. She is an associate professor and director of the school counseling program here at the College of Education. She has an established research agenda focusing on the efficacy of school counselor preparation, multi-tiered systems of support, otherwise known as MTSS, and systemic anti-bullying strategies. She has written about and presented extensively, both nationally and internationally, on topics such as trauma-informed counseling, integrating MTSS into school counseling programs, and cultivating systemic change. So a big DePaul welcome for all our panelists.
Thank you, Diane. Okay. So I'm going to start with this quote from one of my favorite people, Mr. Rogers, who says, "We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those people who see the need and respond. I consider these people my heroes." And we are in need of heroes, especially in today's world where our children face an extraordinary and unprecedented amount of stress due to trauma. So Dr. Stilleman is going to do a deeper dive into this term, but fundamentally, trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So just you can toss out, when we talk about trauma and these experiences, what are we talking about? What are some experiences we may see in our families and children? Violence, absolutely. What else? Assault. Abuse, assault, yes. Death, good. Illness, very good.
Drug use.
Addiction, substance abuse. Poverty, good, y'all, this is good. Any more?
White supremacy.
Okay, yes, in our city for sure. And so here we have what we call ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences, which Dr. Stilleman is going to be talking more about a landmark and groundbreaking study. But these are the ones that we have been studying, which is any form of abuse, neglect, violence in the home, substance abuse, mental illness, separation from parents, and incarceration. We do, as we say, live in this beautiful city of Chicago, where we live and where we work, and like many urban communities, we are plagued by violence, by neighborhood violence. And unfortunately, we've seen some deadly trends. According to the Chicago Police Department's 2017 annual report, there were 653 homicides, 2,782 shootings. 2,782 shootings. That resulted in 266 youth under the age of 17 and under, and 38, which resulted in death. Does anybody see a trend here? And what do you? Yeah, right. And we need to contextualize this about where this is happening within our city. Those light blue dots are shooting victims. The dark blue are homicides. What are you noticing about the pattern here? West and South Side, yeah. And so it's really important that we understand that the context in which we live. A study in the JAMA Pediatrics, which is the largest national representative study to date on ACEs, which again stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, confirms that these experiences are universal, but there are some disparities among socioeconomic groups. People with low income and educational attainment, people of color, and people who identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual have significantly higher chance of having experienced adversity in childhood. The study finds 3 out of 5 adults across the United States have had at least one adverse childhood experience in their childhood. So this can seem overwhelming, but we here at DePaul, who also are located in this glorious but flawed city, are grounded in a very simple but profound mission. We care about our community, particularly our children. We are committed to serving poor and marginalized populations. We understand we are a collective. This is not a problem we turn away from. This is something we confront by seeking out the best information, by sharpening our practice, by finding out what works, and by being someone our children can count on. As educators, counselors, and school leaders, we are on the front lines of this issue. We see the impact of trauma daily in the lives of our students and their families. We do not say, it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. We are part of the solution, because at DePaul, here we do. So without further ado, I introduce you to our first esteemed speaker, Dr. Audrey Stilleman.
So we are going to talk about understanding childhood adversity, lessons from and for our work. And I riffed a little bit on the formal title because what I want to really emphasize is what we're going to be talking about is not about them, it's actually about all of us. And so we can turn this lens in 360 degrees, and I think that that's the best way to do it, for us really to figure out what it is that we're seeing and also what we need to do about it. So here's what I'm going to talk about. We're going to explore how experiences determine health, well-being, and success across the lifespan. We're going to talk about the embodiment of experience. So in other words, how things that happen out here actually get contained in our bodies in multiple ways. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to leverage the science that we know for transformation so that we can move towards the kinds of schools and world that we really want to be living in. Yes, absolutely. Sorry. Before we begin, I just want to say that what we're going to be discussing this evening is heavy. Traumatic experience is actually at the root of health and social problems and disparities, and we're going to be talking about things like abuse, discrimination, genocide, all things that may be incredibly disturbing. We do this really to honor the experience of so many of us, and also to help us identify root causes so that we can go forth and co-create healing spaces. We're going to talk about research, we're going to talk about self-care. What I want to invite you to do is, if it feels too uncomfortable to be here, feel free to get up and take a break. And of course, we'll be sticking around afterwards if you'd like to talk in a smaller setting. So I want to do a little mini orientation, and so we're going to do a little definitional work as we begin, and some contextualizing as well. So our definitions are these, and feel free if there are other words or concepts that we talk about that are not clear to ask us after the presentations. But so adversity is anything that is difficult or a misfortune. Trauma, like Melissa said, is a deeply disturbing or distressing experience, but I'm going to actually give you three kind of criteria to break it down even a little bit more. So trauma is any experience that either threatens us or harms us, people we care about, or people we're witnessing. It overwhelms our ability to cope, and it often has consequences for our functioning in multiple dimensions. Neuroplasticity is the capacity of our brains to change. The cool thing is that our brains can change across our entire lives. It never stops being a possibility. Our brains are the most changeable before they get organized, so that's from conception to about age 3 or 4, but that capacity to change is with us for better or for worse, and so we want to really capitalize on it for better. And then finally, I really want to define this term resilience because we talk about it a lot. So resilience is our capacity to bounce back when things are challenging and difficult. We are born with the capacity, but we're not born with the ability to be resilient. Being resilient actually takes love and care and scaffolding. We actually have to learn how to do it. We have to grow into it. So if we don't have support, we can't possibly be resilient. So we always want to understand that if people are not resilient, it's not their fault. They just haven't had the ingredients to help them grow that capacity. I want to bring the conversation to us right now. So all of you are human service workers or will be human service workers. In the literature and also through informal surveys, about 50 to 80% of us have a personal trauma history. We also know that there has been national scapegoating and abuse of teachers and other people who work in educational settings for complicated but ridiculous reasons. when we are at our work and we hear painful stories or from our family or from our friends, this can actually bring up our own traumatic memories and also cause us new pain because we're social creatures and we have these things called mirror neurons. So what you are feeling, I'm feeling, if I'm looking at you or even awake a little bit. Some of the things that we can do, and we're going to talk about this in more detail as we go through the evening, one is that we can become aware of our own history. We can do some things that help to protect us from secondary trauma from other people's stories. And we can also put some things into place so that we can avoid burnout while we're working on our own business, and we can have long careers where we really continue to contribute in all the ways that we were meant to. This is the contextualizing part. So each one of us is actually part of multiple systems. We have our own human physiologic system. We're part of a family system, part of a community. We're part of organizations. We live in this country. There are policies and procedures that have an effect on us. And we also live in this time and have connections to other times. So all of these layers actually influence our experience and are in sort of bi-directional relationship with our experience. And this is very important for us to keep in mind. Nobody is existing in a vacuum. And so again, these are sectors and places that we can understand and we can leverage as we're trying to build that family, that school, that community that we really want to be in. Okay, question. Do you know some of these people? So our first guy on your left is a little boy who has asthma, chronic disease. Our friend in the middle is somebody who can't sit still and is very fidgety. On the bottom left is a young teen who's smoking, but she could be drinking, using drugs, having lots of sex, what we consider health compromising, and what I would add, and we'll talk about how this is self-soothing behaviors. In the middle, I know you don't know any of these people. I'm not a workaholic, I just enjoy working till 9 p.m. And then finally, these are two teachers fighting with each other, having trouble on the job. What we're going to talk about is going to help you see the connections between these manifestations of some things going on underneath the surface. So back to what Melissa was talking about, we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time about this, but I want to talk a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, which is the beginning of kind of the current last 2 decades work around the connection between experience and outcomes. Now, why I say the current is because we have evidence of these kinds of conversations going on in the Western world, at least as far back as the 19th century. And if you really do a deep dive into the ancient wisdom traditions, this is here. We just keep forgetting. So one of our tasks is to hold on and not let this stuff get lost again. So in the 90s, there was a collaboration between the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, which is actually a managed care organization in California. And together, these two groups of folks did a very large public health study of over 17,000 people in California. And they looked at 2 things. They looked at how common certain childhood experiences were, so from birth to age 18 among their population. And then they looked to see whether there was a connection between these experiences and all kinds of outcomes in adulthood. So physical health outcomes, mental health outcomes, and social outcomes, even death. Their population was mostly white and Hispanic, about half women and men. They were college educated, they were insured, they were employed, so kind of solidly middle class population. And this is what they found. What they did was they asked people about the number of these 10 experiences of abuse, neglect, and household stress they had had. And each person was assigned a score. And then they looked at how common they were, did they have anything to do with each other, and what happened if you had these experiences. And this is what they found. As Melissa said, they found that ACEs are extremely common. Almost 2/3 of the people in this original sample had at least one of these experiences. They found that people who had had one of these experiences were highly likely to have more than one. They learned that these experiences were cumulative. In other words, if you had more than one, you were much more likely to have poor health and social outcomes. So these experiences were profoundly impactful on people's life in adulthood. They were so impactful that people who had 6 or more of these experiences were likely to die 20 years younger than the average population. So here's some of the outcomes that they looked at. They found that adverse childhood experiences can have lasting effects on health, so things like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, again, things that we think of as physical, depression, suicide, drug use, STDs, et cetera. This list is not comprehensive. With many, 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 many more health consequences of ACEs. They found that these experiences were related to, again, what we consider health compromising / self-soothing behaviors, smoking, drinking, drug use, risky sexual behavior. And they also found that they were connected to impairment of life potential. So this work actually was later about graduation rates and academic achievement, but the original study did look at lost time from work, impaired worker performance, worker injury, et cetera. So far, far-reaching consequences. This study was replicated over time across the country, and in fact has been replicated in over 30 countries around the world. And the results are about the same. It's been replicated in some special populations. I mentioned healthcare workers and human service providers, our rates are a little bit higher. Incarcerated populations, slightly higher rates. Homeless people, slightly higher rates. Interestingly, we have some kind of more granular data too. So in the state of Illinois, about 60% of adults have had at least one adverse childhood experience, about 40% of children from birth to 17 based on parental report. And there was a study, actually it was not exactly an ACE study, but they did include some ACE information in it, but it's called the Chicago Longitudinal Study. Actually was a study about the impact of early childhood education. So this was a look at 1,200 people of color from underserved communities, and these people were followed from birth to about age 20, and public records were used actually to confirm their experiences. About 2/3 of these people also had at least one adverse childhood experience. Now, that said, this is not the only bad stuff that can go wrong, as you guys pointed out before we even began. And so some of the work that has been very important over the last 20 years is really expanding our definition of trauma and really trying to figure out how these other experiences have an impact on health and well-being. So injustice we talked about, bullying, white supremacy, heterosexism, sexism, et cetera, poverty, hunger, homelessness, violence of all kinds, war, both the people who are fighting and the people who are enduring it, anything having to do with the carceral system, forced displacement, slavery, genocide. Again, this list is not exhaustive. It's just some examples of things that people have begun to look at over the last 20 years. And we see the same kinds of connections between physical, mental health outcomes, and social well-being. I want to take a special focus in terms of childhood adversity in the classroom, because I know this is where many of you are focusing your attention, or you're at least in schools. So this, I think, is a stunner, but very important for us, that childhood adversity is the single greatest predictor for health, attendance, and behavior. So if we're not paying attention to this, how are we possibly going to solve these problems? They're the second strongest predictor after special education status for academic failure. And I submit to you that actually special education status is connected to childhood experience as well. The relationship between academic achievement and health status appears much less related to income than to childhood adversity. I think, again, underlining the fact that childhood adversity cuts across socioeconomic lines. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we are going to talk about why it is that we see this connection between experience and outcomes. And so we're going to do a little bit of neurobiology, and we're going to talk about how experiences become embodied. So for our intents and purposes, and even actually in my world, for most of my intents and purposes, the brain is made up of three parts. The brain stem, or the survival brain, that makes sure that we stay alive, so it's always checking to determine whether we're safe or not. The midbrain, or the emotional brain, the limbic system is what it's also called. That's our relational brain, that's where our memory lives. And that part of the brain is trying to sort out if I am loved and if I belong here. And then finally, kind of the most uniquely human part of our brain, but the thinking brain, this is the part of our brain that helps us solve problems, be creative, make decisions, etc. The brain begins to develop in utero, and it then continues to develop all the way till about age 25 or 30. From birth to 3 is when we get organized, kind of early primary grades to about middle school or so is when that relational part of our brain is really getting solidified. And then after middle school and beyond is where our cortex, our thinking part of our brain, is really kind of growing and maturing. All those parts are always there, but there's this sequential development over time. Our brain develops in the context of our experiences. And so what's going on, particularly when our brain is organizing, is that we're having a relationship with our caregiver. And so if our caregiver is able to be attuned and responsive to our needs and able to help us develop a strong attachment, our developmental trajectory will go in one direction. If our caregiver is stressed for whatever reason or not able to be connected and attuned to us, then our development will go in another direction. An interesting thing for us to note is that the stress response system is actually there when we're born. It's ready. And so our stress response system also develops in the context of our experiences. And if we are not embedded in that okay enough caregiving relationship, again, with people who have all their needs met and are not struggling with their own issues, then our stress response system develops flexibility. However, if our caregivers are having challenges and can't protect us in the way that they would like to, our stress response system becomes sensitized. And it's much more difficult for it to stay in a zone, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Okay, very important point. The brain and the body are one. There is no brain or body without each other. And so when we have an experience out here, our senses pick up that experience, they perceive it, and they send information to our brainstem. Our brainstem says, is this information threatening or safe? If it's safe, information gets sent to the relational part of our brain. That part of the brain says, does this information tell me that I'm loved and I belong here or not? If yes, information goes up to the thinking part of the brain that then says, what do I do about this? Depending on what happens related to that information influences the information that then gets sent out to the rest of the body. So you can imagine that if we perceive something that is not safe, the survival brain says, I got to do something about this. Doesn't send that information anywhere. Gets the body ready to fight, flee, or freeze. Well, how could you possibly solve a math problem if you don't feel safe? Or if you don't feel like I belong here? That information doesn't get anywhere. So just to review, our brains are built over time from the bottom up and the inside out in the context of our experiences. And this building over time is the manifestation of our neuroplasticity. Our experience and genes together, but really mostly our experience, build brains, and experience modifies genes. All of our development is linked together, again, not separated. Our development is sequential and builds on previous development, and unbuffered toxic stress, in other words, where there are not enough protective factors for whatever reason, not safe in our family, not safe in our community, not safe in our culture, that derails our optimal development. So, nice green wave pattern in the middle. If our caregiving is good enough, if our basic needs are met, if our family feels like it belongs and is not marginalized, then there is a balance. Our excitatory nervous system and our quieting nervous system are working together. And this is the zone, this green zone, where we can solve math problems, we can make relationships, we can create art, etc. This is where we want to be, our kids and us. However, if we have unbuffered toxic stress, in other words, experiences that overwhelm our ability to cope, then we either can get stuck on, which is hyper-aroused, and I know we can all point, in fact, there was couple of those kids on my beginning slide, or we can get stuck on off, where we're shut down, or we can kind of swing wildly between these two poles, never kind of achieving that balance. So many of us have had these experiences, and certainly many of the students we're serving and our colleagues are in some of these zones a lot of the time. It's very hard to learn there and very hard to have relationships in those spaces. So again, just to review this science part, when we have traumatic experience that overwhelms our protective factors, we actually get dysregulation in our nervous system. And this is really the root. It's the place where we can work to prevent problems, and it's also the place where we can develop our most effective treatments and interventions. So when we have neurodysregulation, it actually starts a cascade of all kinds of signaling in all kinds of systems throughout the body. And I know that many of you have probably seen lots and lots of news stories about the connection between inflammation and all kinds of health problems, diabetes, hypertension, autoimmune diseases, et cetera. Well, the inflammation comes from dysregulation of the nervous system. And so as a result of this dysregulated nervous system and our dysregulated physiology, that's how we get all the outcomes that we saw in the ACE and follow-up studies. So, not that we like to spend a lot of time talking about money, but I think that this is important. So what if we just kept going and we didn't really put this information into practice? Some folks looked at this in 2014, and what they estimated is for each individual case of child maltreatment, and again, that did not include things like segregation or war, bullying, et cetera. really was very focused on, sort of the ACE study. It costs $1.8 million per victim across their lifetime. I mean, imagine what we could do with $1.8 million per person. And I'll just have you look too, high school dropout rate, that's $250,000 to $450,000. That's a lot of money and a lot of heartache. So I think it is imperative that we begin to weave this science into our practice in all kinds of places. So that's what we're going to talk about now, how we apply the science. So this slide is actually from the government's Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, who's done a lot of work on trauma-informed organizational change. And they came up with 4 R's. I added a 5th one. But they kind of break down trauma-informed organizational transformation into these categories. So first is that we realize how common traumatic experience actually is. The second is recognizing that everybody is really affected by trauma, either directly or because of our connections with others, and so that it has an impact on everybody in every system, not just a few people. Our charge is to respond to these realities by putting knowledge into practice, so putting that science into practice, developing strategies based on that. And also, our charge is to create milieus in which we don't hurt people more by the way that we go about our business. And then finally, my addition is that we work to actually build resilience for ourselves and for the people that we're working with and support healing. So breaking it down even further to something that we can actually hang on to, what does this mean? So these are some simple but profound aspects of trauma-informed practice. The first is actually creating an environment that's both physically and emotionally safe for everybody who's in that environment, kids and adults. Building relationships and connectedness, and then supporting, teaching, and practicing emotional regulation. This is a bottom line thing. We're going to talk in a little bit more detail about what that is and how you do it. So when you practice, teach, and support emotional regulation, everybody spends more time in that zone, in the green zone. And that's where learning happens, that's where healing happens, that's where we want to be as much as possible. So, number one, before we can put the oxygen mask on our kids, we got to put it on ourselves. We have to take care of ourselves, but I don't say you have to take care of yourself. I say, please take care of yourself. Let's take care of each other. And to our organizations, you must take care of us. You can't leave us floundering around here. Lots of ways to take care of ourselves. These are foundational health practices. Again, if you go back to the ancient wisdom traditions, here it is. Nothing new. So thinking about how we put all of these things into place at least some of the time in multiple contexts. It's good for us to think about how do we have a trauma-informed and compassionate classroom and school. Okay, so we're going to learn the science. We started doing that today. We need to support and practice regulation. We're going to talk a little bit. Well, I'll tell you right now what that looks like. No, I have another slide on that. I'll move on. We're going to create a safe space. We're going to build relationships. We're going to establish predictability and prepare for transitions because, of course, novelty is one of the things that makes our brain go danger, danger, danger. It's not safe here. We want to offer choices to our colleagues, to our students, to our spouses, et cetera. Much easier for people to ride along if they feel like they have some autonomy. And again, one of the hallmarks of trauma is that we feel out of control. We want to stay curious and not get furious. So what is it? I'm seeing this behavior, this symptom, this whatever. I wonder what's behind that, as opposed to, Anyway, and then we want to really avoid punishing people for behaviors that are really trauma symptoms, and so knowing what those are. So here's what are the fundamentals of regulation. We want to look for activities and practices that are rhythmic, repetitive, rewarding, relational, relevant, in other words, developmentally appropriate, culturally appropriate, and respectful. So these are things like singing, knitting, coloring, dancing, bouncing a ball, playing cards, many, 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 many things that really could be woven in for a few minutes multiple times throughout the day for you and also for your students or other people that you're working with. I don't want to go into this in too much depth, but this is a key way of helping people stay regulated. So dosing the activities throughout the day. So you could make yourself a little lesson plan where you have a few minutes of this and a few minutes of that. Again, appropriate activities depending on the age and abilities of the people that you're working with. But this makes for a much happier and more productive day for everybody. And also, then the whole day becomes therapeutic. It's not just 1 hour once a week. We need to partner to provide wraparound services, and we need to build coalitions so that we can work together for transformation. So there are critical supports. If we don't have these basic needs met, you can forget it. So these are things that kids need and their parents need too. And one of the things that we really need to think about, again, as school communities, is how we truly connect with parents and how we love them and care about them and respect them, because a lot of them are struggling with a lot of stuff as well. When we work across sectors, our work is synergistic, and so the kinds of outcomes that we get are beyond what we could possibly see if we just work in the school, or we just work in the health center, or we just work in the child welfare system, et cetera. So it's really, really important for us to, the other thing is no one person could do everything. So we want to partner so that we are able to, help people get as many of those needs met as possible. And frankly, there's no learning that's going to happen until this stuff is taken care of. So I want to tell you just a little story about a high school in Walla Walla, Washington, which is the subject of a great movie, which I highly recommend that you see. It's called Paper Tigers, and it's available widely and in multiple languages. Anyway, Lincoln High School was an alternative school. It was the last stop. So the kids who had been kicked out of everywhere else, this is where they went. And as you can imagine, the kids had a lot of stuff to contend with. The principal of this school was a very traditional educator. And then because of a community-wide effort to learn the science about trauma and health and school, he learned about adverse childhood experiences, and he was transformed. And so he helped his teachers and other school staff learn about the science too and think about how they could put things into practice. So what they did is they had lots and lots of access to all those regulatory activities that I shared with you. They cared about each other, they cared about themselves, and they loved those kids. And what they found over the course of about 5 years is that their graduation rates went up from 18 to 78%. Their suspensions were down by about 85%, expulsions down by 40%. And their office referrals were down by 50%. They also had better grades and test scores. I couldn't find the numbers for you, so I didn't include them. But again, these were the kids that nobody wanted to have anything to do with. And just in 5 years, they had incredible, incredible success. Again, they were embedded in a community that was committed to doing this work, but a lot happened in that school because of the commitment of the adults and the responsiveness of the students who were there. So again, back to money. What do we get when we invest in doing these kinds of things? And the kinds of things here that people looked at were parent education and coaching, home visiting, quality early childhood care and education, and pre-K. So for every dollar that we invest in these kind of things, we get $6 in return. And a lot of it is on improved educational outcomes, which actually have a huge impact on everything else. They have an impact on health, they have an impact on jobs, and they have an impact on the system as a whole. So not only is this the right thing to do, it actually saves money. So to recap, our experiences are a powerful determinant of our health, well-being, and success across the lifespan. In the absence or with insufficient protective factors, childhood adversity and trauma at all levels, individual, community, structural, and historical, cause neural inflammation, they cause derailment of normal physiologic processes, and they become lodged in our bodies. And finally, we can leverage the science that we know now to create the kinds of schools and, frankly, a whole world that we dream of. So I'm going to end there, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lauren, but we'll take some questions at the end. So thank you very much.
Hello, good evening, everybody. You guys still with us? All right, just doing a check-in. So thank you, Audrey. Audrey did a wonderful job at laying the foundation for me, speaking very scientifically. I will talk a little bit about the importance of being culturally aware in the communities that you will be working in, and some of the subcultures of those communities, and then also piggybacking off of Audrey, the importance of building and establishing relationships outside of the school systems, because it really does take a village to help and raise any child. So I will say that as a mental health provider, one with over 12 years of experience, a lot of, I think I'm pretty smart, I think. But I have to say that school did not prepare me for the experiences that I had. A lot of my career has been spent working in traumatized communities on both the south side and west sides of Chicago. A lot of it was not textbook. So I very quickly understood that I needed to become the student in these communities. I did not grow up in some of these communities, and so if I was genuinely going to help our babies, as I call them, I needed to humble myself and truly not enter as one telling the community what to do and how to do it, but to understand where they were coming from, to understand the history behind some of the things that existed. So some of the communities, very complex trauma. So not just trauma, but complex trauma. Years and years of trauma, years and years of being impoverished, disparities, something that many of us don't even think about, not having grocery stores, right? So not even having access to, and this exists today, not even having access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And so understanding the importance of diet on your mental health, the importance of diet to be able to sit in a class and take a test and to comprehend, are all things that I had to quickly learn about. I was not ready for the amount of gun violence that I would experience, because it was more, as a counselor working for an outside agency, I consulted with many of the schools, and I was thankful that many of the principals of these schools and teachers truly understood that unless a child's mental health was healthy, it would be very hard to produce outcomes. So unless some of those basic needs, if we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if those basic needs aren't met, even in us, we are not going to thrive. And so to listen to metrics being pushed, understanding the importance of metrics, right? Because many of the schools, funding is decreased if they don't produce metrics. And so understanding that side, but very grateful for the principals and the staff that were willing to allow me to come alongside of them and offer another point of view so that we could collaboratively work together. And I think some of that came in desperation. I would have teachers saying, I don't know why they're flipping over desks. I don't know why they keep running out of the classroom. And if you think about having about 20 or 30 students, and even just 11 or 12 of them have experienced some form of trauma. That then can cause trauma to the other students, because every time you have to redirect Johnny, you have to stop teaching, right? This is probably the stuff that they don't necessarily go over in your program, and I'm not trying to scare anybody away. I will end with some uplifting tidbits, but I'm here to offer reality for some of the communities and spaces that you will go into. And so, principals would come, teachers would come, and they would say, well, Johnny just doesn't pay attention. He just doesn't want to learn. Sally is disrespectful. And so I would ask, after even positioning myself as a student to the teachers, listening to them, understanding them, not coming in trying to take over, can I observe? Can I just observe? So they would allow me time to sit in the back of the classroom. So I heard the teacher's point of view, heard the parents' point of view, and then I would sit in the back of the classrooms and very much observe the real effects of trauma. So everything that Audrey just spoke about, I have witnessed firsthand. So for example, you might have a student who you're teaching, and it just seems like they are not paying attention. And you're like, can you please pay attention? I need you to focus. I need you to pay attention. And then you find yourself getting upset, and teachers have to emotionally regulate themselves as well. It is hard to manage a classroom. Hats off to you guys. It is hard, 7-8 hours. And so what I would observe is it that Johnny's not paying attention, or when I would pull Johnny to the side, Johnny may be disassociating, because at night, Johnny is being molested and must go to a faraway place in his mind that he can remain safe. And so, unfortunately, the body doesn't have a switch that says, I'm in school, it's safe. But if the teacher yells, or even doing this, I learned, right? You think you're comforting, but if you don't understand the background, you don't understand if a child has been traumatized, that could actually be a trigger, right? And so these little tidbits that which are really huge, that I think if teachers had ahead of time, it would actually help them get through the day much more. I worked in communities where students witnessed multiple shootings, multiple homicides, multiple suicides, and I'm talking about babies as young as 8 years old. So if we think about our fully developed brains as adults being able to handle something like that, how can a child whose frontal lobe is not fully, so logic is housed in the frontal lobe, how do you even make sense of that? Today I'm with my friend, and tomorrow he's just gone. He's gone. And so I was very grateful for the opportunity to come alongside and explain the very real effects on children at seeing something like that and enduring something like that, and understanding culturally that we cannot generalize. So you may have a group of students who live on the west side or the south side of Chicago, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the same experience from house to house. But the experiences that they share is, if they live in the same communities, they all know what it is to hear gunshots, right, which is traumatizing. They all know what it is to constantly hear ambulances going up and down their street. They know what it is to see police officers arresting their friends for no other reason than simply maybe the color of their skin. They know what it is to be hungry. They know that. They know what it is to not have anyone at home because mom has to work 3 jobs just so we can make it. And so, in listening to their stories, positioning myself as the student, one thing I learned about children and teens, when they see that you genuinely care, no matter the color of your skin, no matter your background, they will just pour it out. But here's the challenge, right? As teachers, as educators, you don't have the space to necessarily do that, right? You are instruction time, right? You have to teach, right? You have to teach. You have your marching orders from the top down, and so it's challenging. And so therein lies the importance of getting the buy-in from principals and faculty to bring in folks like myself to kind of help come alongside. And even that's still challenging because you're kind of limited to the amount of time you can pull children out for instruction, but it was very helpful. I think that much more helpful than if there had been no resource, right? So with some of the children, we could use something called solution-focused brief therapy. which is where we identify the student's strengths and then come up with some goals. So maybe the teacher is like, you know what, Johnny just won't turn in his homework, and I don't know why. So I would listen to Johnny, what's going on with your homework, and then maybe come up with a plan, share it with the teacher. We're on the same team, and then Johnny could move forward. But then you have some children, like I said, who've experienced very real complex trauma who need higher levels of care. So some schools would allow me to pull that child maybe twice a week to provide trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, right? But then there are those who need an even higher level of care, more so like a 60-minute, once a week type. Even that's still not enough in some cases. And so the relationships that and I don't mean just Googling mental health organizations, and then you can't do that. You have to be willing to really learn the community, because we had folks referring families to agencies that had a wait list like 6-8 months long, right? So when you do that, sometimes the families become discouraged, because in some communities it's still very taboo to even receive mental health counseling. And so if they take the step to trust you and call the number and they tell them, oh, you don't have insurance, or our waiting list is long, that can be very discouraging to a family. And so even now, before you finish your program or wherever you are, if you're already out, take some time and just really invest in and look into relationships that would kind of address the whole child. With some of the slides that Audrey shared, she talked about the critical supports. That is very critical, because you're going to need support. You're going to need support. And then sometimes those of you who are teachers, when you're meeting with families, because it's not just the child, like teachers, you will become a counselor, you will become a mother, you will become a father, you will become, you're spending the most time with that child throughout the day. And so I'm so glad Audrey spoke to secondary trauma. I myself, after probably 11 years, realized that I experienced a deep level of secondary trauma. During the time where the homicides increased in Chicago, specifically among our youth, I was counseling in about 4 different schools. So different days of the week I would go to each school, and I had my caseloads, and I had interns from a lot of the universities in Chicago. They had their caseload, and I was providing supervision. And across 4 of these schools, for weeks on end, I would get calls on Saturdays, on Sundays, from the school counselors saying, so-and-so has been shot, so-and-so has been murdered, so-and-so has been, and it just was nonstop. And so what that would look like for me is, okay, knowing that and trying the best I could to do my own self-care, to pray, and then enter the school. And a room would be, I would give them instructions over the phone, create a room where students could come and make cards and just very openly talk. But then when they would openly talk, they would openly talk about all of the things going on in the community that many teachers had no idea, because there were so many teachers that would come teach and then leave. And so they had no understanding. They had no cultural awareness. And so that would happen, and then I would have to go from floor to floor to speak to the classrooms and provide space for anyone to ask questions. Then I would do professional developments with teachers, because they felt that they could not just break down in front of their students. And then I had principals who broke down behind their doors. And so after doing that for so many years, and then I could be counseling a child one day, and then the next day they would have been murdered. And so I remember being at a school, and I was there from 6:30 till about 5 o'clock. And I sat in the parking lot, and tears just rolled down my face, and I could not move. Literally, my body was frozen. I could not move, and I felt nothing but pain. That is one effect of trauma, secondary trauma, where you're feeling it on your shoulder. I literally felt it throughout my body, and I had to call someone just so that I could drive. And at that point, I said, it's time for me to take a break. And I didn't know. It kind of snuck up on me. You know how sometimes you're stressed and you don't even realize you're stressed until maybe you start catching more colds or you pass out or something. I had no idea. But when I looked back, going to therapy myself and was able to process, because see, I couldn't process that in every space. Where do you can't just go home and say, hey, let me, everybody can't handle what you will see and what you will hear, because what you will see and what you hear will go outside of any book that you have ever studied. And so the beautiful part of it all is that there is research that says if a child has just one caring adult, one supportive adult, and no, you cannot be everything to that child, but if you're supportive and if you're caring, there's a greater chance that that child will thrive and that child will go on to do great things, because it's hard to know that you have to send a child back into those communities. That's hard. That was one of the hardest things to me that I couldn't fix, like just wave a magic wand. But somebody told me, but you're planting a seed. And so you guys will plant seeds that you may not see the fruit and the manifestation right away, but as time goes on, and even some of those kids come back and say, thank you. If you had not been here, I don't know what, I would have killed myself, or, just different things. And so those are the things that kind of, kept me going. Just knowing that I was doing good work, getting support on my own, and then all the other resources that I had, and just being grateful for the schools that were so cooperative. And I'm stressing that because I've worked in some schools. Again, I know the pressure is high from the powers that be, and them not truly understanding the importance of mental health and how it even intertwines with teaching, like understanding the brain and how it functions, understanding the difference between a traumatized brain and a brain that hasn't experienced trauma. It is my belief that you can't even really teach them the same way according to what we know. And so I am going to, I know I'm talking so fast, and like Diane said, I am very passionate about this topic, passionate about the work that I do. It is my lifelong work. It just has different forms. And so I definitely look forward. I'm sure many of you will have many questions, but again, just more so to now just paint the personal experience and like a picture of what may be some of your realities. And maybe some of you won't go into communities like this, but you will experience children who have experienced trauma. Divorce is very traumatic. It just is. And sometimes we assume certain things are not affecting children because you have the child that is more introverted and not, still getting good grades and but that doesn't mean that that child is okay. And so, not to limit it to the South and West Side, some of those communities, but just to bring it very back up to the real reality of trauma and the different types of trauma. I spoke more to complex trauma. So, I am finished because I could talk about this all day. I could talk and talk and talk, but I'm so excited that so many people are willing to sit and listen and learn and then take what you learn and go out. Like, our babies need you guys. And so thank you so much for listening.
So, good evening, everybody. Oh, no, you can do better than that. Good evening, everybody. I am absolutely delighted to be here. As Diane mentioned earlier, my name is Christine Argue-Mason, and I am an Instructional Resource and Professional Development Director with the Illinois Education Association. That's like a really, really long title. But I have to tell you that more important than any other title that anybody could ever give me, there are two that I hold on to very dearly. One is that I'm a teacher, and the other one is that I'm a parent. I have 3 children, and they all were delivered to me on the same day. They're not triplets. They are my great niece and my 2 great nephews, and they showed up to my family, parents unattached. And you have to know that when something like that happens, that those children quite possibly are coming from challenging places. And so this work is, for me, very personal. and very meaningful. And I live the idea of taking theory and putting it into practice every single day. I want you to know that even though you signed up to come to a symposium, that you signed up for something else too. And even if you leave right now, it will never change. You all are ambassadors. You are absolutely ambassadors. We need you because we are, quite frankly, dealing with a public health crisis. When we talk about adverse childhood experiences, and when we think about the statistics that Audrey shared with us, it affects everybody. And because it is affecting everybody, we have to have an approach that's like a public health approach, which means all hands on deck. When we first started this evening, Diane was asking who was in the room, and I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. I know we're in an educational setting, so I'm curious to know, regardless of whether you're a DePaul University student or matriculating somewhere else or have already matriculated, your content areas of study. Are there any, if this pertains to you, I need you to say, that's me, and I need you to say it just like that, okay? So do we have any math people in the room? Do we have any English people in the room? Any foreign language teaching in the room? Any music folks in the room? Any social studies or history folks? All right, okay, just, we're gonna revisit that in just a minute. But I wanna talk to you about something that relates to that ambassador word that I threw out there. And I'm hoping that you'll understand that we have a job to do. And it starts with us as individuals, strengthening our individual knowledge and skills, and that's what we're doing here today. That's what we're beginning. And when we do that, we have an opportunity to enter into our own spheres of influence and our own portals of entry to help people to become more aware about adverse childhood experiences and what we should be doing about it. And when we do that, we then become sort of experts, and we have an opportunity to educate providers, even our own physicians, even our own children's teachers. We're sharing with them information that they may not know. When we do that, we start breaking down silos and we begin to work together and leverage our assets so that we can do more. Ultimately, what we want to do and what we have to do when we're talking about adverse childhood experiences is change policy. Because quite frankly, what you've been asked to do and what you are going to need to do is requiring you to retrofit something into a system that doesn't currently allow for it. So when I say ambassadors, I'm talking about utilizing your spheres of influence and your portals of entry to move the conversation so that we can have things open for you to be able to do the things that you need to do. Self-care is not a luxury. It is a human requisite, a professional necessity, and an ethical imperative. And so far, you've heard something like that a few times this evening. So we have a tremendous amount of work to do with the young people, with our babies. But the truth of the matter is that if you want to be around, you have to be able to last. And if you want to last, you absolutely have to take care of yourselves. I have a really good friend. She's now retired. Her name is Winona Brewster, and she worked with the Illinois chapter for the American Association of Pediatrics. Pediatrics, their specialty is kids. And one of the main things that Winona Brewster and her colleagues did was to educate educators about self-care, because they know, and we know, that in order to take care of those, we have to take care of ourselves. So she provided me with this nugget, and she asked me to share as widely and as often as I could. And so I want to share this acronym with you. It's HALT. You may be familiar with it. If you're not, jot it down or take a snapshot of it. But basically, when we say HALT, we're saying never let myself get too hungry, never let myself get too angry. And we know there's a thing as hangry, right? Never let myself get too lonely, and never let myself get too tired. That's surface level. I wish we had more time to delve very deeply into self-care, but just understand this. Self-care is proactive. It's something that we plan. It isn't something that happens to us because we fall apart. So we need to be proactive about it, and we need to be comfortable enough to advocate in our workspaces and in our living spaces to say that this is absolutely necessary. I know you came here to talk about ACEs, so we're going to talk a little bit about that now. Here's what I think is critically important to understand. Whether you are going into the teaching profession or currently in the teaching profession or in a capacity in some way to interface with a young person, you have to know that building relationships and growing student skill sets is absolutely in the teachable moment. And culture and climate is everything. So how do you do that? In thinking about what Audrey shared with us about some of the difficulties that happen as a result of adverse childhood experiences, we know that there is going to be social impairment, emotional impairment, and cognitive impairment, which means that we do have to scaffold for our students to help them with their social emotional learning skills. A moment ago, I was asking what your content areas of study were, and I heard a lot of them. But I want to ask you a question. Whether you are currently working with students or getting ready to work with students, what skills do you want them to have when they approach the world? Like when they graduate from high school, what skills do you want them to have? And you can just yell them out for me. Tell me what you want them to have. To be woke. Problem solving. Critical thinker. Collaborative. Compassionate, empathetic, coping, confident, independent, humble, driven, kind. You know what I didn't hear? I did not hear the Pythagorean theorem. I didn't hear the quadratic equation. I didn't hear anything about subject-verb agreement. I didn't hear any of that. But in our studies, you know, that's who we drill down on, and that's the content area that we approach our students with. But at the end of the day, when we think about them going out into the world, the skill set that you're asking them to have or that you want them to have is all of what you just put into the room. So the question is, what time are we taking to make sure that that happens? Especially if we now know the science and the data behind what actually happens to the brains of our children who are experiencing adversities. We're not born that way. We have to be taught. So I just want to challenge you to say that if, in fact, those are the skills that you want your students to have when they graduate, we have to carve out some time in order for that to happen, which is often the teachable moment. And also, remember, ambassadors, we have to advocate for that time and space because the current system that we have doesn't necessarily support that, okay? We do have opportunities, though, and I want to spend some time really talking about a framework that if you could embrace would be of assistance. So everything that we're talking about today, or everything that I'm talking about right now, really has to do with universal tier 1 stuff that everybody in a space where there are young people should be doing. So in the state of Illinois, we've had the great opportunity to work with CASEL. CASEL is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. They have a website as a resource. It is a powerhouse of information. And what CASEL has done is worked with the state of Illinois. Illinois is actually one of only 3 states that has social emotional learning standards as a part of their Board of Education. So the ISBE has social emotional learning standards. If you're not familiar with that, get familiar with it. I want to take a second to just demystify the social emotional learning standards and talk about what CASEL is presenting, because in some spaces and some schools, people believe that social emotional learning is for the counselors to do, or the social workers to do, or those people to do. But quite frankly, that social emotional learning is for all of us to do. So if I could take just a minute to demystify, if you will, the opportunities and really what we mean when we're talking about the social emotional learning standards. If you look at the pie that's on the screen there, you'll see 5 slices, but really there are just 3 colors. The first set of colors is orange, and those social emotional learning standards or competencies really connect with the me of an individual. So I'm saying, as an educator, whether you're a counselor, teacher, it doesn't matter, what you're asking yourself is, how can I, as an educator, help this person to be more self-aware? How can I, as an educator, help this person manage themselves? Trust me, and you know, there are plenty of teachable moments where you can make that happen. So there may not be SEL curriculum in a particular building, but if you know that in the teachable moment you can help an individual to understand the me about their own self-awareness and their own self-management, you're moving them leaps and bounds. The next 2 pie slices are sort of a greenish color, and that is the me individual and how they relate to another person in terms of relationship. So as an educator, you're saying to yourself, how can I help this young person to become more socially aware? How can I help this young person with relationship skills? Maybe it's teaching them the damage of gossip. Maybe it's teaching them the damage of a rumor. Maybe it's teaching them the power of a compliment. All of those things are in the teachable moment. And then the final pie slice is in yellow, and that is the me as the individual and the relationship with another person, and then the space that we show up in, right? So it's me, you, and everybody else. And quite frankly, in a lot of school systems, we spend a lot of our time in that space, incentivizing extrinsically for people to comply, and behave for the good of all. And when we do that, very often there's a disconnect between the individual self. So we can take the time to help them to develop the me, we would get a little further. So this is CASEL and their social emotional learning components. But in the state of Illinois, we have 3 social emotional learning standards. And you'll see that goal 1 is about developing self-awareness and self-management. Goal 2 is about using social awareness and interpersonal skills to establish and maintain positive relationships. And then goal number 3 is demonstrating that decision-making skills and responsible behaviors, not only personally, but in school and in the community context. So I provided the ISBE link. If you had some free time and you wanted to check out the learning standards for social emotional learning. Some people think that social emotional learning is the warm, fuzzy stuff, and it is. But there are also some real solid gains, and I wanted to share the statistical data with you so that you know that what you feel in your gut you should be doing, that you really ought to. So these are some statistics and some data from a meta-analysis that was done. And it was a huge analysis. There were over 200 evaluations. The breadth and width of the study took into account urban, suburban, rural, school systems and a variety of social emotional learning programs. And as a result of that, you see that there were gains in social emotional skills. There was improved attitude about self, others, in school, positive classroom behavior, and certainly last but not least, I mean, we are talking about school and education. We have to have academic press. An 11 percentile point gain on standardized achievement tests. That's real growth. That's real growth. It happens. There's a reduced risk for failure, conduct improved, aggressive behavior decreased, and emotional distress was less. So again, this is tier 1, universal type stuff that we all can be doing every single day that has major impact. So you might say, okay, so how do we do that? Well, I'll tell you that with the Illinois Education Association, we've had an opportunity to work with a number of districts. We pull them together, we ask them to select their dream team to participate in training that we provide. We call it resiliency team training. And those teams come together. They're comprised of teachers, instructional assistants, school board members, administrators, et cetera. They come together and they learn that brain science, because we know that if we don't know the brain science, we might rush to solutions that don't work. So we spend time learning the brain science. And then we present the components of what should be involved in a trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive school. And then we present some framework. So a number of school districts have embraced those ideas, and they are seeing major growth. The statistics that Dr. Stillerman shared with you from Lincoln High School, if you were to visit or have a conversation with Jim Sporleader, that's the principal, he's retired now, but if you were to have conversation with him or his staff, they would tell you that what I'm talking about is what they're doing. In U46, in Elgin, in Schaumburg, in Oswego, a number of school districts that we're working with, they are using these frameworks. So one is mindfulness. And mindfulness, based on the definition that you see on the screen here, if you look to the left of that screen, you'll see the SEL standards. You can see how utilizing mindfulness in a classroom speaks to those standards. I'll also tell you that while we're talking about mindfulness for students, if we're really talking about self-care, we need to be talking about mindfulness for the practitioners, and that's us, right? So so mindfulness is one of the things that a number of our school systems are employing, and it's having major impact. I had an opportunity to observe a first grade class. One of my colleagues invited me to visit, and it was the coolest thing to see 6-year-olds talk about their amygdalas and know what they were talking about. Also, in terms of the SEL standards, as practitioners on Tier 1 universal level, we know that we must be explicit in our instruction about self-regulation for students. We are not born with those skills. We have the capacity, but we have to be taught those skills. And so on the screen there, you will see two graphics. The first is a book. It's by Susan Craig. It's an excellent book. So for your graduation gifts, contributions to your professional libraries, ask for that. She talks about what administrators can do, and she talks about what educators can do. And the biggest part of it is really helping students to discover who they are, what their weaknesses are, what their strengths are, and how to build on all of those. In the lower part of the screen, you'll see what looks like a bullseye. That is something that Jim Sporleader shared with me. He said that he had to make sure that his staff understood the vocabulary and that the students understood the vocabulary before they instituted the use of that. Basically, it's helping students to acknowledge where they are when a crisis or a situation comes up. It's all connected to their discipline policies. But one of the things that Jim Sporleader shared with me is that not only is it important for students to know where they are in managing their stress, I'm going to take this back to self-care. He said you must know where you are in handling your stress, because dysregulated adults cannot help dysregulated students. Okay? So again, if you look at the social emotional learning standards and you think about being explicit with your instruction about self-regulation, you're supporting those standards and you're getting closer to your goal that you told me today in this room that you would like for your students to have when they graduate from high school. Adverse childhood experiences, restorative practices, and student discipline is a winning combination. So in the state of Illinois, sometimes we do things really well, and sometimes we don't. In 2015, I believe, we instituted a new bill, Senate Bill 100. It had everything to do with discipline. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Senate Bill 100. A lot of people think Senate Bill 100 means that you cannot discipline students and that now we have to keep everybody in the classroom regardless of whatever it is that they're doing. That is not true. That is not the spirit of the law. We know that it was passed in 2015 because of student voice. And I need to just take a second to tell you what I mean by that. Senate Bill 100 did not come about because a bunch of adults sat around and said, I think this might be a good idea for our kids. That's not what happened. Really, there were students who were suspended or not in school, and there were some adults with a listening ear to hear why. And then they started to do the research, and they found that in the state of Illinois, there was growing evidence of discriminatory discipline. There was a rising awareness of the damage of exclusion. In other words, the kids that we were putting out were the ones who needed to be in school the most. And then what's really exciting is that there was an increased understanding of restorative practices. Now, restorative practices and restorative justice, unfortunately, get a bad rap. And I think it's because we don't always take the time to define and properly train on what that is. So those statistics, this is data from 2014. Haven't had an opportunity to update my data. I'm hoping that these numbers have gone down, but here's what we know. Some of you may be wondering why preschool students are being suspended or expelled. And to be honest with you, a lot of it is because the practitioners, the classroom teachers and instructors, are not aware of the brain science. And so they are not necessarily equipped or have had the professional development to assist them with strategies to help to keep those students in school. So we're talking about a transition away from zero tolerance policies, less school-wide focus on punishment and suspension, and more of a focus on teaching students how to handle situations differently. I also wanted to share with you another resource that you could ask for graduation or your birthday. This book, Fostering Resilient Learners, by Kristen Sowers and Pete Hall, is an amazing resource. It talks about really what you can do to build resilient learners. There are some determining factors, some things that we can look at right away to know that our students are challenged. And he gives some real concrete examples and strategies of what to do. At the end of the day, really, what we're talking about is a paradigm shift. And my hope is that you're already there or on your way. And it is moving from asking the question of what is wrong with you to what happened to you. Thank you.